Hi there. Welcome to Exam AZ-900, Microsoft Azure Fundamental Study Guide. This is episode 7 of 63, Cloud Deployment Models. My name's Tim Warner. All right, our objective today in the Exam AZ-900 objective domain is first, at the functional group level, understand cloud concepts. Second, at the objective level, describe the differences between public, private, and hybrid cloud models. And our specific skill is describe and contrast public, private, and hybrid cloud. Go to timw.info/AZ900 to get a download of the exam objectives organized into an Excel spreadsheet. Now, in the previous episode of this series, we looked at IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS, and those are called cloud service models. It's how you're delivering your actual applications, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. Today, we're concerned with deployment models. The public cloud deployment model is where all the IT infrastructure that runs your applications run on the service provider's hardware. Now, some businesses go with more than one public cloud provider in order to give themselves maximum disaster recovery capabilities, maximum flexibility. That's called a multi-cloud architecture. And of course, both Microsoft Azure and Amazon Web Services are examples of public cloud service providers. Because Microsoft has this region map of data centers all over the world, we'll learn all about regions in an upcoming episode. Microsoft is able to give businesses high scalability and agility, remember those vocab words from earlier, that would be extraordinarily expensive to do on your own. We also saw that in the public cloud deployment model, the pricing is based on consumption. I found that most businesses will approach the hybrid cloud before they consider anything like private cloud. Hybrid cloud's a common model because you're combining your on-premises local data center infrastructure with what's available in the public cloud provider's cloud. So your IT services run partially on-premises and partially in a public cloud. Now, please never use the term premise. Premise is an idea. Premises is a location. We don't run IT services on-premise. We run them on premises. I can't believe where I sometimes see that misuse. Even by some cloud solution providers, you'll see it on their website. I just shake my head. I want to make sure that by the time you complete this course and you earn your Azure Fundamentals badge, you have full conversational ability to discuss the Azure public cloud using the correct terminology, okay? We learned in a previous episode the difference between operational expenditure, which is what we have in the cloud, and capital expenditure, which is what most businesses have on premises for paying for their IT. I often say to my students and to my consulting customers that the movement from local IT into the public cloud requires a fundamental paradigm shift. It's not the same thing. You'll want to approach your cloud deployments in a different way. There may be at base some of the same goals, but the way you accomplish them is vastly different. Private cloud is where you're taking advantage of cloud scale and resource pooling and all of the great benefits we learned about the cloud, but the IT services and all infrastructure is being run locally with local data centers. One of my good friends here in Nashville is an infrastructure engineer for a large healthcare conglomerate. And I say to him, why is your company even doing anything with Azure and AWS, which they are, when they spend so much money building out a private cloud infrastructure where they've just got this incredible fabric of compute and network and storage where they can just tear off chunks of that compute whenever they need to. In other words, they're doing a lot of the same kind of things that we do in Azure, but they're doing it all locally. This private cloud idea can be extraordinarily expensive because you're implementing your own scalability, your own agility, the whole thing. The advantage is that you've got full control of not only your data, but the underlying hardware and software. The disadvantage primarily is cost, and I would also throw in the management overhead that's involved. Now, Microsoft makes the private cloud a bit easier to do nowadays with Azure Stack, which we'll talk a little bit more about in the demo. In the demo, I want to illustrate some of these concepts about public cloud, hybrid cloud, and private cloud. Let's start with public cloud. You might think, well, Tim, Azure is a public cloud, so does that mean that my data is readable by the general public? The answer to that question is no, not unless you either misconfigure something or if you do it intentionally. Let me show you what I mean. Here in the Azure portal, if I navigate to the Storage Accounts blade, let's take a look at one of my storage accounts, TW Cloud Storage. And if I search the settings list for properties, we can take a look at what are called the endpoint addresses for the different storage account services. Let me show you what I mean. So the blob service is where we can store files, any kind of resource files that we need and need to be able to get to. And notice that there's a blob service endpoint that takes the format HTTPS storageaccountname.blob.core.windows.net. Now that is a public URL, and the deal with Azure or any public cloud provider is that as you deploy resources, unless you take additional configuration steps to screen them from internet access, they do have internet-based endpoints, as you see here. Now, if I open up an incognito, or I guess Edge calls it an in-private window, and I attempt to go to that endpoint directly, I'm not going to get anywhere because it's an authenticated endpoint, you see. So just because you've got these public URL endpoints dangling out in the breeze doesn't mean that any of that data is accessible for anonymous access. As I said, though, you can override that in a number of different ways. For example, in the storage account blob service, if I can scroll down the settings again, down to the blob service containers, I can select a container and change its access level to allow anonymous access to the files inside that container if I want to. For example, if I'm hosting a publicly accessible website, then I may indeed want to do that. Another thing you can do is go the other way, where you're saying, I don't want those public endpoints active at all. I want to, let's say, interact with a storage account only from the privacy of, say, an Azure virtual network. Well, you can do that as well. As you can see in the storage account settings, you can say instead of allowing access from all networks, I want to constrain access only to virtual networks that exist within my subscription. And there's actually a couple different options there that you can choose from. With regard to hybrid cloud, a couple different ways we could look at this. One is if I just do a search in the Azure portal, you see that there are several types of gateway devices. The main one that you use to create what's called a site-to-site virtual private network is a virtual network gateway. And that's going to be an always-on connection, a secure tunnel between your on-premises network and an Azure virtual network. And in so doing, you're effectively extending your on-premises environment into Azure. You can also use the virtual network gateway to create an express route connection. We'll talk about the networking stuff later in this course, and I have to remind myself because I teach both Azure technical content as well as more non-technical, which is what AZ-900 is, that we'll get to that later at that point. Website that you may be interested in, if you are a technical person, is the Azure Architecture Center, as you can see here. In particular, they have a reference architecture library where you can look at Visio diagrams and example workload diagrams for various and sundry ways to connect, including you can look at hybrid cloud topologies that combine or extend your on-premises environment into Azure. And lastly, for private cloud, it used to be a long time ago that Microsoft published a series of server products called the System Center product family, and that's still around. Those products still exist. But they attempted to give you some of the tools that we now expect or take for granted with cloud services running in the public cloud. Well, now, as I said a few minutes ago, we've got Azure Stack. And as of fall 2019 at the Microsoft Ignite conference, the Azure Stack portfolio is broken out. The traditional option here is called Azure Stack Hub, and this is literally a black box rack that you lease or purchase, put in your data center, and it's essentially a freestanding copy of the Microsoft Azure public cloud. And it's useful for businesses that want to develop applications and want to take advantage of all the goodness that Microsoft Azure has to offer. But maybe for data sovereignty reasons or security policy reasons, you can't touch the Azure public cloud. But what's neat also about Azure Stack, in addition to it being Azure in a box that can run in a completely air-gapped and isolated environment, you can, if you want to, link up Azure Stack to, on one hand, Azure Active Directory running in the Azure public cloud, and or you can federate from Azure AD running in your Azure Stack rack inside your network to your local Active Directory. So Azure Stack comes in many form factors, and it's extremely flexible and allows you to take Microsoft Azure, not all of its features, but a good subset of them, to just about any kind of physical environment. Really cool. For learning resources, you know I'm going to send you to Microsoft Learn, the Azure Fundamentals Learning Path. Look at cloud deployment models at timw.info/CDM1. Second, go to that page I just showed you a moment ago in the demo to learn more about Azure Stack and the Azure Stack product portfolio. That's timw.info/ASP. Coolio. Well, I'm hoping that you're enjoying this training. I do hope that you're watching these lessons sequentially because they do build. You might or might not have noticed that. You can reach me on Twitter at TechTrainerTim. All of my Pluralsight Azure training is at timw.info/PS, and my website is techtrainertim.com. Happy studying. I'll see you in the next episode.